So we're going to look at research gaps in a literature review. So we're going to enumerate the types of research gaps. So firstly, we need to identify or understand the research process. That research is mainly about you getting to discover new insight, arguing what is already there, or perhaps developing a new theory. So in the process of research, we are identifying gaps that are very crucial for establishing originality of a study. So research gaps are simply areas where knowledge is missing, where knowledge is underdeveloped, where knowledge is inconsistent. So you as a researcher, you should identify 4 kinds of research gaps. So I'll take you through step by step these research gaps. So there's a section in your exam that will require you to have short word answers so you understand concepts. So now, as I take you through, I also need you to actualize what I'm going to teach you in your proposals. Some of you already have done your proposals, but you have areas that have not been done accordingly. So I'll take you through what gaps are. By definition, a gap is simply a vacuum, a missing item. So there's one gap that we call the theoretical gap. So the theoretical gap is one which exists when there's lack of sufficient theoretical explanation. So when there's an existing theory that fails to fully establish a problem being studied, we come up with what is called a theoretical gap. So we know theories come from already established theories that people have come up with, phenomena. So you can come up with a theoretical gap yourself as a researcher to argue out to say, okay, this theory that was done by so-and-so lacked this aspect. So when a gap arises, you want to resolve a certain phenomenon. But these gaps will arise, number one, when the phenomenon is new or it's still evolving. It also arises when the theories are outdated or they fail to compensate the recent development. It is one reason why we encourage most of your researchers to ensure that your research is within the decade bracket. So now we're in 2025, and so your research should be within 2015 to 2025. Some theories are still applicable even now, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Hesbeck. They're still updated despite them being theorized in the 20th century. 1965. So again, you could come up with a theoretical gap. When there are multiple theories that provide conflicting explanations, you as a researcher can come to address this theoretical gap by introducing a new theory. I'd be happy if one of you came up with a theory that we can work with. All right, refining what is existing or coming up with something new. I have come up with formulas. I think those that I took in first level. There's a Collins theory that I took you through in QM. So theories are there to correct the errors that are there. For instance, if you're studying a topic on digital addiction among teenagers, but there's some lack of some robust theory to explain the behavioral linkages to social media use. So you can come up with a theory. So this is one type of theory that you need to know. It's called a theoretical gap. 4 marks. So the other theories that you should know of, or the other gaps that you should know of, we also have what is called the empirical gap. What is an empirical gap, or what is empirical literature? So we know empirical literature is simply literature based on what others have studied. So we come up with what is called an empirical gap when existing studies are inconsistent with the results. So when there's little or no data on the topic that you are suggesting. So this type of gap exists when prior studies are contrary to what you believe in, or when there's limited or no research in a specific area, or when past data is outdated or poorly represented. That is what we call empirical gap. Are we together so far? So empirical literature is simply literature based on the findings that have been done by others. Say in SA or Malawi, there's a study that was done on load shedding and the impact. and you realize that empirical literature focusing on Malawi doesn't correlate with Zambia, you could now engage yourself in what is called an empirical gap to argue, qualify, or modify existing findings. So an empirical gap will involve you conducting a new study to provide clarity. Can you hear me? Am I audible now? Annie, can you get me? Am I breaking?
No, you're clear.
Now.
All right, okay. Please, I hope there's no much background sound. I'm not in a class arrangement. I hope there's not much noise. So the first gap I talked about was what? The literary gap. What did I say about the literary gap? Gaffy?
Theoretical.
The theoretical gap here. What did I say about it?
This is where a gap where there's a theory which is missing or which has failed to address the problem that you are studying.
Okay, great. So now we're looking at the empirical gap. What did I say about the empirical gap? Somebody else? So empirical gap is based on other findings. If they're inconsistent or there's little data on that topic, so you engage yourself in what is called an empirical gap. All right. So we also go to what is called a methodological gap. A methodological gap. So there's a methodological gap that is also invoked when you discover that the methodologies that we engaged do not conform. It occurs when the prior research employed inadequate or outdated or inappropriate methods. This could have been leading to questionable findings. It's common. So you have a small sample that wasn't representative, there wasn't any vigor in data collection, or you over-relied on one type of method, either qualitative or quantitative. You engage yourself in what is called methodological gap. So this gap is addressed by you using more robust and innovative or mixed approaches. So you can engage yourself in a methodological gap. So we also have the last gap, which we all are preview to. It's called the knowledge gap that most of you want to update. So the body of knowledge, I want to increase on the body of knowledge. So the knowledge gap is one which is contextual and practical. It exists when the existing research fails to address specific population or settings. So it reflects the absence of applicable knowledge in the real world. So here, you want to fill in a gap with practical utility of research by tailoring to address pressing needs within specific groups. This is called the knowledge gap. Okay, quickly, what are the three gaps I've talked about that exist? Number one was the theoretical gap. Number two was the what?
Empirical.
Empirical. Empiricals are about what? The findings. The findings do not conform. They are left out some data. Number three, what gap? Methodological gap.
Methodological.
And lastly, the knowledge gap, where
Knowledge.
it is also called a contextual or practical gap. It exists when existing research fails to address specific population settings or emerging issues. All right. So these are the four gaps that we
4 years old, and I was saying, in 3 years, I'm going to have a child. In 3 years, in 3.
Okay, Sheila, is that a question, a contribution? So now let's differentiate between quasi-experimental and experimental research designs in quantitative research. I think I had a explain this. What is the difference between the two? Huh? What's the difference between quasi-experimental and experimental research design in quantitative research? So in quantitative research, we have experimental and quantitative. These are commonly used when you're testing the hypothesis, when you want to test causality, cause and effect. So they are very similar, but they differ significantly in terms of control, in terms of validity, in terms of participant assignment. So the experimental research design, when do we use it? So experimental research design, when do we use it? So quickly, the experimental research design is like a global standard. It's considered a global standard approach in quantitative research because it is the ultimate that we use when we want to establish causality. So it is got a unique feature which is called random assignment of participants to different groups. So the characteristics that experimental research has is that there's random assignment of participants to experimental or control groups, and it involves manipulation of independent variables to observe the changes in a dependent variable, and it has high level of control over the confounding variables. I've been explaining what the confounding variables are. So here, we must understand that participants are randomly assigned. That is a key difference that is observed. And for instance, you're looking at a study where you're looking at the teaching methods and the performance of students. So you're going to randomize the teaching method to a particular number of students assigned either a new method and the traditional method. So there's assignment. This new group, I'll give them the new teaching method, and the other ones I'll teach them the normal way to see whether there's a difference in the output. So this is called experimental research design. Then we also have the quasi-experimental research design. The quasi-experimental design. What is it and what does it involve? 4 marks for each. These short word answers you need to remember, apply. So the quasi experimental, it involves manipulation of independent variables, but it lacks the random assignment. So groups are the groups are pre-existing or assigned based on non-random criteria. So the characteristics here is there's no random assignment where groups would be naturally occurring or self-selected. The other characteristics that it still includes manipulation, intervention, and there's reduced ability to control the confounding variables, which limits the strength of causality. So here, the quasi-experiments can suggest a cause-effect relationship, but they lack randomization, and it induces the aspect of bias or alternative explanation for the observed outcomes. So for instance, you want to study the impact of workplace wellness program on employee stress levels, comparing them from two different branches. So you can have one, which is an intervening group with the program, and another, which is a comparison group. So here, the key difference is that here, we have no random assignment. So the difference between the two can be summarized in a table as shown below. So if you want to see the key differences between quasi-experimental and experimental research design, we can look at random assignment. For experimental, there is. For none, for quasi, there is no. Manipulation, there is in both. Control over variables, it's high for experimental, it's low here due to lack of randomization. And causal inference, it's strong for experimental and moderate for quasi. Examples here are clinical trials for experimental and traditional interventions for the quasi. So these are the key differences that you must take note of. Right. What are the various types of literature reviews done in research studies? So this is lesson 1, which we did. the different types of literature reviews. Who remembers? The different types of literature reviews. So literature reviews, we know they play a very critical role in summarizing existing knowledge. So there are different types. Each of them have different purposes. Their scope, their depth, their goals are different. So we have a systematic and a narrative literature review. We have a meta-analysis. So let me quickly run you through each of the types of literature reviews that you need to know. So we have what we call the narrative literature review. Narrative is a traditional one. So this traditional one is as follows. So its approach mainly is to summarize prior research without using standardized methods for selecting or evaluating studies. It's more flexible and has broad insights. The limitation is that it's prone to bias because you lack a systematic direction. So here, the narrative review is one where we're going to review various studies on climate change and how they impact um, climate without selecting a criterion or exclusion. You're just narrating, okay? Then we have a systematic review, which involves you having a rigorous or transparent reproducive method to identify, to evaluate, and to synthesize all the relevant studies on a specific topic. Its strength is that it has high reliability and also reduces bias. The limitation is that it's time consuming and it's complex. So the systematic reviews basically may use example when you're reviewing the effectiveness of COVID vaccines in different populations. So you'll be moving systematically from how COVID came. So we have a narrative review, we have a systematic review, okay? And we have what we call a meta-analysis and a scope review. So these are the 4 types of literature reviews that you need to know. So what is involved in the meta-analysis? So the meta-analysis is like a sub type of a systematic review, which uses statistical techniques to combine from multiple studies. Its strengths are that it provides precise effect on size estimates. Any questions so far? Are we clear? Any questions so far? Please ask where you're behind. So this is very important. It's very important for you to know and differentiate. So we've just been talking about the types of literature reviews. We started by the narrative, which is also called the traditional literature review, where it provides a broad overview and a summary of existing literature in a particular topic. So unlike the systematic, the narrative, we said it doesn't follow a predefined order or a structured method of selection. Instead of others, you select relevant. It allows you to be more flexible. So it's more flexible. It allows for critical discussions. Okay, the limitation is that it's susceptible to what is called selection bias. There's no standard or protocol for choosing. So we talked about the systematic review, which is highly structured. It clearly follows the methodology to identify and synthesize all evidence available. So it's a type of review that minimizes bias because it's a transparent and replicable process, which includes you predefining the exclusion and inclusion criteria. So its strengths lie in that it reduces bias and the results are highly reliable and reproducible. So the limitation is that it's time consuming and it's complex. Okay. Then we are looking at the meta-analysis. The meta-analysis is a subtype of the systematic review. It uses quantitative statistical methods to aggregate and analyze data from different multiple independent studies. Here, it allows you to calculate the overall effect size or relationship between the variables, and it reduces it produces a more precise estimate of the effects. So its strengths here that it will ensure that the statistical power, it's useful for identifying some patterns. The limitation is that it's only feasible in quantitative data. Then lastly, but not the least, we have what we call a scoping review. A scoping review is used when you want to map the existing literature on a broad topic, especially where the field is complex and emerging. Okay, unlike the systematic reviews, the scoping review here doesn't typically assess the quality of evidence in detail, but it focuses on the key themes, the research gaps, and future directions. The advantages is that it's ideal for exploratory purposes and identifies scope and nature of the available research. The limitations here that it doesn't evaluate the validity of the studies. So these are the types of reviews that we have. Okay, these are the types of the reviews that we have. And lastly, but not the least, we go to the last two questions and we can end for the night. So what are the prominent research designs used in mixed methods? And how does construct validity differ from criterion validity? So here I want you to participate. Under mixed approaches, what research designs are prominent there? I think over lunch I had explained that. Nzovwa, what are the prominent research designs that we have under the mixed?
Sorry, what's the question again?
We have a mixed research design. We have a mixed method approach. So what are the most predominant research designs that fall under mixed methods?
Maybe let me guess quantitative and qualitative. Not sure if that's the question.
So by the way, we're talking about the types of research designs that fall under what? Under the mixed approach. So we have the explanatory, we have the convergent, we have the exploratory, and you can also use the embedded research designs. Okay, so these are the most common types of research designs that we have under the mixed approach. So I repeat, under mixed methods, the most common research designs that we use as follows. We have the convergent parallel. We have the convergent uses both qualitative and quantitative data. These ones are collected simultaneously and analyzed separately. We also have the explanatory sequential research design. It starts with quantitative, but followed by qualitative. It has a mixture of both. It's useful when quantitative needs deeper in-depth. We also have what we call the exploratory. It begins with qualitative to explore ideas and develops into quantitative to test or generalize the findings. And lastly, we have the embedded research design. Here, one data type is nested within the larger design within another type, then it's often used for evaluations. So these are the types of research designs that are applicable to the mixed approach. All right. So lastly, but not the least, the question we have is, how is construct validity different from criterion validity? How is construct validity different from criterion validity? What's the difference between construct validity and criterion validity? Okay. So we can look at it in terms of focus and examples. So I'll give you a comparison table. We call it a night. So the difference between comparison and between construct validity and criterion validity can be illustrated in this table. So what is construct validity? What is construct validity and criterion validity. So construct validity will assess how well the test or the instrument truly measures the abstract concept it claims to measure. So this construct validity will examine the logical relationship between the test and the theoretical concept, often evaluated through convergent and discriminant validity. Then we also have criterion validity, which examines how well one measure predicts an outcome based on another established observable benchmark, which is a criterion. The two types of criterion validity we talked about, predictive validity and concurrent validity. The predictive validity, it focuses on future outcomes, whereas the concurrent validity, it correlates the outcome with the what is measured at the same time. So these are the difference. So the differences, like you've seen there, the construct validity will focus on how well the test measures the intended concept. An example is depression, inventory matching. Then criterion looks at how well the test predicts the outcome. An example is an exam predicting the first year college GPA. So this is how you're supposed to answer this short 20 marks. So you need to have an idea of each of these concepts. So your homework will be to basically redo what I have given you. I'll randomly ask as we have our class during the Easter period. So we'll be having intensive classes during that period and here.